Hi everyone, my name's Robert Faggian. I'm from Deakin Centre for Regional and Rural Futures. In our centre we focus on issues related to regional livelihoods and regional communities. My particular group focuses on climate adaptation. We have probably 10 PhDs and 40 or 50 masters now working on different aspects of the problem, generally related to agriculture or agricultural development. I'm going to whip through, I've got more slides than I should, but this is the annual mean temperature for Victoria during a recent 10-year average, 96 to 2005, which takes in most of the millennium drought, so it's already hot and dry period. And that's our projections for, or CSIRO's projections for 2050. So substantial temperature increase, and as we all know, a similar situation with rainfall dropping. What's interesting for us is that our food bowl areas, if you like, will be the most impacted. Now, working in climate change adaptation in agriculture is sometimes difficult because most of the messages are bad. So we try to focus on the positives wherever possible. And to do that, we've looked at talking about the growing world population, and the fact that Australia is still one of only 11 net exporters of food, so there's a role for us to play, given that we can still produce a lot of food to feed the world. And also China's growing middle class. This is now a 6-year-old image, so it's changed quite substantially, but back in 2014 they had 75 million people classified as middle class, and that was projected to be pushing 400 mil by 2035. And that's already grown quite substantially. And as they transition to middle class, dietary preferences change. They want more meats, more sugars, more oils. And again, that's something that we can capitalise on. Now, we produce models to look at the impact of climate change on crop yield. We do that by looking at soil parameters, climate and topography. We map it in a geographical information system, and wherever you see this dark green colour is where we'd expect to get close to 100% yield for that particular commodity, and as the colours transition to lighter greens and eventually yellows, we see a drop-off in yield. Now, this is the version of our model where we insert only scientifically available information. What we do, partly because there was a famous British statistician, I think George Box, who once said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we try to go through a process where we go out to farmers and talk with them about the model. We show them that first iteration, say, well, does this reflect your reality? If not, we drill down into the model and have them provide input, help us formulate the model. And you'll see this is the pre-validation and post-validation versions for asparagus in the Western Port green wedge areas. Quite a substantial change. On this one we had state-level soil scientists arguing non-stop with us, saying that there are soils out here that are ideal for asparagus, so the models are wrong. But when we spoke with farmers, they said, well, that might be the case, but if I've got a farm out here where the soils are top shelf, my machines will get bogged in winter. So I'd prefer to have a farm here where I can get 2 crops through per year at maybe 90% possible yield than one at 100. So everything that we put into these models is biased towards practical reality. And just as an aside, that little green blob there produces roughly 93% of Australia's asparagus. It's the 8th largest in the world by production volume, but only 12th largest by area. So wherever we can match the commodity well with the biophysical environment, we find that farmers are applying less nutrients, using less water, and therefore there's benefits in terms of off-site impacts. Now, just to show you a slightly larger example, this is some work that one of our PhDs is doing in the southwest, looking at perennial ryegrass. This is the situation relative to historical climate, and that's what we're expecting in 2070. So as I said, bad news, but what we can do then is go in and model a whole range of alternatives so that we're presenting options and not just doom and gloom. So this is looking at red wheat. Top left is historical, bottom right is 2070, and you'll see the situation actually improves over time for red wheat being used as feed. Plantain, phalaris, panic grass and lucerne. And in all cases there's either no decline or there's an improvement over time if we switch up to a different pasture system. Now, a couple of years ago now, we did some work for a group of councils through the Central Highlands region with the support of DELP. I'm only going to show one of the outputs, but if you're interested, you can do a search for future landscapes. That was in conjunction with Cultivate. So this is similar modelling outputs, looking at cool climate grapes on one side and warm climate grapes on the other, and just doing a little time series, 2030, 2050 and 2070. So given that some of these areas are marketing themselves as a cool climate grape capital of Australia, maybe want to think ahead a little bit about what varieties you've got planted. In the work that we did with the Central Highlands group of councils, we also looked at biodiversity, but in this case we modelled different vegetation classes as a proxy for different animal species. This is plains grassy woodland today versus what is possible in a warmer and drier climate. So we can do this with a range of vegetation classes and thereby start to overlay the natural environment with the agricultural environment and look for possibilities to prioritise one over the other by saying, well, this patch of remnant forest, it's going to find it difficult in a future climate, so let's focus on this one here where we've got a better chance of preserving it. Meanwhile, over here we've got some highly productive agricultural land that could generate lots of jobs, and we could see the shift of food bowls to this area, so let's focus on that. This is not an output of that particular project, but some work that one of our master's students is doing at optimising for best outcomes in terms of regional communities. So we're looking at where things can be grown with the least inputs, where the waste streams can form closed loop systems with other economic activities, how we can integrate biofuel production, ecotourism, etc. So we can start to think further and further ahead as we understand better the impact of climate change on what underpins regional economies, and that's generally agriculture. Now quickly to other regions, we also have a variant on the model where instead of looking at the soil's capacity to produce crops, we look at the soil's capacity to hold up structures. And here we take out of consideration the prime ag land areas, so they become restricted zones in the model. We also restrict the environmental assets, and wherever you see the green colour is where we are suggesting urban expansion occurs. So this is occurring on very marginal soils for agriculture and areas where there is no strong environmental asset. Now, just to bring it all together a little bit, we've done similar work in Gippsland, but in Gippsland we did 25, 30 models. So when we overlay all of those models, we can start to look for trends. These green highlighted areas are where we expect to get high yields for 6, 7, 8 different commodities out to 2050, regardless of what climate change does. So these are the most versatile areas. If we take a closer look at one, this is Orbost. We use the yield information to start doing analysis on other systems. So here we're looking at what happens if we transition all available land in Orbost into intensive horticulture. what happens to the transport system? So these blue properties have access to irrigation water already, or they're already producing fruit and veg. The rest is beef cattle. That's with the transport system overlaid. And a little bit difficult to see, but the green highlight indicates that there's no stress on the transport system in Orbost now, given the current mix of industries. If we start transitioning that land, available land, to intensive hort, you see there comes a point where the transport system is starting to feel the pinch. And at this point, we've quadrupled employment in Orbost, substantially increased the amount of money flowing through the town, but the impacts on the transport system are problematic in terms of repairing and maintaining the feeder roads, not necessarily the Princess Highway, because the Princess Highway will stand up to most changes at present. The other thing to note here is that this is the 1 in 100 year planning flood overlay. In this area, we're seeing that much more frequently. So they've had a 1 in 100 year flood event in 1990, 97, 2007, 2012. So if we're promoting Orbost or any particular location as a prime spot for agricultural development, we have to have the water situation sorted. To do that, we're working with the Dutch. So they have a system called blue-green infrastructure. If they have a waterway that floods, they'll dig a ditch some distance off, maybe create an artificial flat. When that waterway floods, the ditch becomes a temporary water storage facility, and if it's a more severe flood, we might have a temporary wetland. And that's a system implemented in the Netherlands. Again, we've got a couple of PhD students looking at the feasibility of implementing this in Australia, and particularly Gippsland, and looking at some of those historical floods. If we deploy 13 or 14 of these blue-green infrastructure elements across, in this case, Lower Tarwin, and it's not all ditches and so forth. There's probably 65 different elements. But if we had deployed these across Lower Tarwin, which was severely impacted in 2012 by flooding, there would have been zero impact. Elsewhere, this is Macedon. We're looking at the economics of the situation and how we can optimise land use for job creation. And here we're looking at a range of scenarios of lower prices for different commodities, changes in exchange rates, changes in water price. So to put it all together and returning to Orbost, we know now precisely where to place these blue-green infrastructure elements to return that to a true 1 in 100 year flood overlay. And the thing with this is that, as we've seen in New South Wales and all over the country in recent years, we oscillate between drought and flood. A system like this can capture flood water rather than letting it flow out to sea, and then we can smooth out the amplitude of the flood and drought curves a little bit, because we store that water and release it for later use in irrigation or other uses. We know precisely where to direct the expansion of towns so that they're only covering very marginal soils. Given our understanding of yields, we can dictate the location of processing facilities so that they don't become stranded assets in the landscape and they're constantly providing sources of employment. If we dictate their location, then we can strategically upgrade roads so we don't have that problem with transport systems. And then we've got a nicely functioning regional economy that's resilient to climate change, and we can start looking at other opportunities. If anybody's interested, you can have a look at growingreaterhamilton.com.au. They've got a publicly accessible mapping system with our outputs that you can zoom in on individual properties and look at the climate impacts. And a couple of closing points. The value of our historical knowledge of climate is declining. We can't assume any longer that because we always had a planting time in May, that will be the case in the future. So we have to continually update our knowledge and change our expectations with respect to agriculture. The existing agricultural landscape is not going to persist into the future, and it's critical that we act now, that we develop strategic plans and we implement them. we've got a lot of climate adaptation reports and information collecting dust on shelves. They've got to be put into use. My contact details will be circulated, I assume, so thank you.